The dust had barely settled on Martha Pritchard's boots when she realized she had no earthly idea where she was, and the very last thing she intended to do was let a single soul in Caldwell, Kansas, know it. She stood at the edge of what passed for a main street in the year 1878, her chin lifted at an angle that could only be described as deliberate, her dark eyes scanning the crooked row of clapboard buildings as though she were surveying land she already owned. The general store sat to her left, the feed mill to her right, and somewhere between the two, the promise of a life she had crossed half the country to find. She had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, with a carpetbag in one hand, a deed to a quarter section of Kansas grassland in the other, and a name, her late father's name, stitched into the collar of every piece of clothing she owned. She was 26 years old. She was alone in a way that had no comfortable description, and she was hopelessly, completely lost. Not in the spiritual sense, though that might also have been true. She was lost in the practical, cartographic sense. The land agent who had sold her father's estate, and then sold her this deed, had described the property as sitting a quarter-mile east of the Caldwell water tower, past the bend in Elm Creek, and just south of where the old Hendricks fence line used to be. None of that information was useful to a woman who had only just arrived on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, and who was standing in front of a town that had, by her count, 3 water towers and no visible creek of any kind. But Martha Pritchard did not ask for help. This was not a character flaw she had ever thought to examine. It was simply the way she had been constructed, hammered together by a father who believed that a woman who admitted to weakness would be consumed by the world, and tempered by years of watching that theory prove correct in the lives of every woman she had ever known. She had watched her mother defer to men who made worse decisions. She had watched her schoolteacher yield to the school board's opinion on matters the schoolteacher understood far better than any board member ever would. She had watched, and she had learned, and what she had learned was that the surest way to keep your dignity in this world was to never let anyone see you without a map. So she stood there, holding her carpetbag with both hands now because the strap on one side had begun to fray sometime around Dodge City and she didn't trust it. And she studied the street with the concentrated expression of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. She did not know where she was going. The street was alive in the way that frontier streets were alive in the late 1870s, not elegant, not peaceful, but thoroughly, chaotically human. A pair of cowboys rode past on horses that looked better fed than their riders, trailing a cloud of red-brown dust that settled on Martha's traveling coat and made her press her lips together. A woman in a calico dress crossed from the dry goods store to the milliner's shop without looking up, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate every puddle and loose board in this particular stretch of road. A man outside the livery stable was having an argument with his mule that the mule appeared to be winning. Martha watched all of this and tried to construct from it some useful information about the direction of Elm Creek. She was still trying when she became aware of someone standing beside her, not immediately beside her, perhaps 10 feet to her left, leaning against the post that held up the modest overhang of what appeared to be the land office. He was a tall man, not in the theatrical way that some men were tall, as though they had been stretched for effect, but in the quietly physical way of someone who had spent a great many years working outdoors and had simply grown into the space that work required. He wore a brown canvas duster that had seen considerable weather, a hat that had been good once and was still serviceable, and boots that were scuffed in a pattern that suggested regular riding rather than carelessness. He had a jaw that could have been used to set fence posts, and eyes the particular color of winter sage, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized immediately and resented on instinct. He knew she was lost. She looked away from him and studied the horizon with renewed intensity, as though the horizon had recently become the most interesting thing she had ever seen. The man's name was Martin Wallace. He was 31 years old, owned 420 acres of grassland and cattle range about 6 miles southeast of Caldwell, and had come into town that morning for the entirely mundane purpose of collecting a shipment of barbed wire from the freight office. He had not intended to spend any portion of his Tuesday standing outside the land office, watching a woman in a gray traveling coat try to decipher the geography of Caldwell through sheer force of will. But there was something about the particular angle of her chin and the precise way she was holding that carpetbag, both hands gripping the leather like she was daring it to fall apart, that had arrested his attention in a way he couldn't comfortably explain. He had lived in Kansas long enough to recognize that look. He had worn that look himself once, years ago, when he had first come west from Tennessee and found himself standing in a landscape so enormous and so indifferent that the only reasonable response was to pretend you had been expecting it all along. He watched her for another moment. She studied the horizon. He pushed off from the post and walked toward her, and he did it slowly, because something told him that a woman holding her carpetbag like a weapon was not a woman who appreciated being approached quickly. "Excuse me," he said. She turned. Her eyes were very dark and very direct, and she looked at him the way a schoolteacher looks at a student who has interrupted a lesson at a particularly inconvenient moment. "Yes," she said. The word was polite in the way that a drawn curtain is polite. It acknowledged his presence while simultaneously discouraging further investigation. "I don't mean to intrude," Martin said. He moved his hat in one hand, more out of habit than strategy. I've got the feeling you might be looking for somewhere in particular. I know this town pretty well." "I appreciate that," Martha said, and her voice was even and pleasant and absolutely final. "I am perfectly oriented, thank you." Martin looked at her. He looked at the carpetbag. He looked at the way she had been standing for the better part of 10 minutes without moving in any direction whatsoever. He looked back at her. "Elm Creek," he said. The silence that followed was brief but very full. Martha's jaw tightened by a fraction of a degree that she would have denied if questioned. "I beg your pardon." "Most people who look the way you're looking right now," he said, and his voice was not unkind, only thoughtful, "are usually looking for Elm Creek, or the schoolhouse, or the post office which moved last spring and half the town still doesn't know where it ended up." She regarded him for a long moment. He had an honest face, she decided. Not handsome in any obvious or aggressive way, but honest in the way of open country. What you saw was what was there, and there were no decorative additions to confuse the matter. "Elm Creek," she said, and the concession cost her something. She could feel it costing her, though she kept her face composed. "I have a property, a quarter section. East of the water tower." "Which one?" he asked. She blinked. "Which one what?" "Which water tower? There are 3. She had known there were 3. She had not known which one was relevant. "The deed says east of the water tower." Martin nodded slowly. "That'll be the old Hendricks deed, the quarter section south of Elm Creek Bend." Her eyes sharpened. "You know it." "I know every piece of land in a 20-mile radius of this town," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was simply a fact, stated the way you state the weather. "Worked this county since 1869. The Hendricks property sat empty for 2 years after the old man died. You're the first person to claim it." "Belonged to my father," she said. "He bought it in 1874 and never made it west." Something shifted in Martin's expression, not pity, which she would have found intolerable, but a careful, quiet kind of recognition. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her slightly. "Could you, that is, the directions in the deed are not particularly useful to someone unfamiliar with the area." "I can point you in the right direction," he said. "It's southeast. Past the grain mill, left at the fork where the cottonwood fell over and never got cleared, straight on past where you'll cross a dry wash, and then Elm Creek will come up on your left. The property starts about 50 yards past the first bend." She listened to this with her brow slightly furrowed, not because she didn't understand it, but because she was committing every word to memory with the focused attention of someone who had no intention of asking again. "The cottonwood," she repeated, "at the fork. You can't miss it. It's been lying across the east side of the road since last winter. Somebody's going to move it eventually." He paused. "Do you have a horse?" She had not thought about the horse. She had thought about the land, the deed, the surveyor's description, the money she had left, the tools she would need, the winter that was coming, and approximately 40 other things. She had not thought about the horse. "I will arrange one," she said. Martin looked at her carpetbag. He looked at the road that led southeast out of town, which was not short and was presently baked under a Kansas September sun that showed no particular mercy to women in gray traveling coats. He made a decision that he was aware might not be welcome. "I'm headed out that way myself," he said. "Barbed wire delivery southeast of the creek. I've got a wagon, it would be no trouble." Martha opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at this man, Martin Wallace, who had a wagon and knew where the cottonwood was, and had not once looked at her with anything other than a kind of calm, respectful attention that she was not entirely accustomed to, and she made a decision of her own. "I would not want to impose," she said, which was as close as she was capable of getting in that particular moment to saying yes. "It's no imposition," he said. And he picked up her carpetbag before she could think of a reason to object, and he walked toward the freight office, and after a moment she followed him, because what else could she do, and because the sun was very hot, and because the cottonwood tree would have defeated her. The wagon was a good, solid farm wagon pulled by 2 bay horses that Martin had clearly cared for well. He loaded the coil of barbed wire into the bed with the efficient ease of a man who loaded things for a living, set Martha's carpetbag beside it with considerably more delicacy, and helped her up onto the bench seat with a hand that was offered and not insisted upon, which she noticed. They drove out of Caldwell in silence for the first few minutes, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which she also noticed. The town fell away behind them, and Kansas opened up around them. That particular, enormous Kansas openness that had no equivalent east of the Missouri River, the kind of landscape that made a person feel simultaneously very small and very free, as though the land had expanded the sky on purpose and invited you to expand along with it. "You came on the Santa Fe line?" he asked after a while. "From Kansas City," she said. "Before that Cincinnati. Long way." "Yes," she agreed. Another silence. A meadowlark sang from a fence post they were passing, and the sound of it was so clean and clear in the warm afternoon air that Martha felt something shift slightly in the tight construction of her chest, some small gear that had been wound very tight beginning, very slowly to loosen. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, and the question was casual and genuinely curious, which was not the same as the questions she asked most people, which were generally practical and pointed. "Since 1869, he said. "Came up from Tennessee after the war, or after enough of the war to know I was done with the direction my life had been pointed in." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, his hands easy on the reins. "You fought. Infantry," he said. "Union." He said it the way people say things that are true and complicated and have been processed over many years into something manageable. "My family was not pleased about that, Tennessee being what it was, but I've always been better at following my own judgment than the rooms." Martha looked at the road ahead and thought about that. "I understand that quality," she said, and there was something almost rueful in her voice that she hadn't meant to allow. He glanced at her then, the briefest glance, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I expect you do," he said. The property revealed itself gradually, the way good land does, not all at once but in increments. First the creek, glittering and alive in the afternoon light, moving south through a cut of cottonwood and willow that broke the flat Kansas plain like a green signature. Then the rise of ground that marked the beginning of her quarter section, a gentle swell of grassland that caught the late sun and held it, so that the whole field seemed to breathe with slow golden light. And then the house. Martha had not known what to expect, but she had not expected this. The house was small, 2 rooms, she judged, perhaps 3 if whoever had built it had been optimistic, and it was made of the milled lumber that had only been available in this part of Kansas since the railroad came through. The roof was intact. The windows were boarded. The porch, such as it was, listed slightly to the left as though it had been leaning into a prevailing wind for so long that it had given up the idea of standing straight. But it was standing, and it was hers. She was quiet for a long moment looking at it. "Hendricks built it in 1871, Martin said, pulling the wagon to a stop at a respectful distance. "Never was much of a carpenter from what I heard. But the bones are good, the lumber's sound. The porch tilts," she observed. "Nothing a few hours with a level and some new supports wouldn't fix," he said. "The well is around the back. It was good water the last time anyone checked it, which was a while ago, but Elm Creek is reliable if the well needs work." She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for his help, which he did not comment on, and walked toward the house. She tried the door. It was swollen in the frame from weather and disuse and required a shoulder to open, which she provided without ceremony, and then she was inside. The interior was dim and smelled of dust and dry wood, and the particular absence of people that gathers in empty rooms over time. 2 windows, both boarded, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a floor made of puncheon boards that were rough but solid underfoot, and against the back wall, left behind as though whoever had abandoned this place had been in too much of a hurry to take everything, a cast-iron stove that was, as far as Martha could determine in the thin light, functional. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed in the smell of it, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years and had nearly given up expecting to feel again. The sensation of a beginning. Martin was waiting outside when she came back out. He had not followed her into the house, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. "It will do," she said. He nodded without any particular inflection, as though this were the verdict he had expected and he was not going to make any additional commentary about it. "There's a good general store in town," he said. "Henderson's. They'll have what you need to open the place up properly. Lantern oil, flour, salt pork, nails for the porch." He paused. "If you want, I can give you an account of the neighbors, who to trust, who to watch, how the county works in terms of water rights and grazing." Martha looked at him. The sun was getting lower now, and it caught the planes of his face at an angle that made him look like something someone had carved out of the particular kind of patience that this landscape required. "Why are you being this helpful?" she asked. The question was direct and genuinely curious, and she asked it without accusation, only because she wanted to know. Martin considered this honestly. "Because nobody helped me when I came out here," he said at last. "And it took me 3 years longer than it should have to learn things I could have learned in a week if someone had just told me." He looked at the house and then back at her. "This is hard country, Miss Pritchard. It's beautiful and it's worth it, but it's hard, and there's no good reason for it to be harder than it needs to be." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening wind had come up, moving through the grass so that the whole field rippled and shone, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek a dove was calling. "Martha," she said. He looked at her. "My name is Martha," she said. "Miss Pritchard sounds like I'm about to be examined for a teaching post." He almost smiled then. It was a very good almost smile, she thought. "Martin," he said. She nodded. "Thank you for the directions, Martin," she said, "and for the ride." "The barn is in better shape than the house," he said, in the tone of someone offering practical information and not an excuse to stay. "If you need, I can help you pull the boards off the windows before I head back. Shouldn't take long, and you'll want light in there tonight." She should have said no. She was fully capable of removing window boards. But the sun was already painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose, and the house was dark, and she was, for all her capability, alone in a place she had never been before. "I would appreciate that," she said. It took them less than half an hour. Martin had tools on the wagon. Of course he had tools on the wagon. She could not have invented a more practically prepared man if she had tried. And he worked with the efficient speed of someone for whom physical problem-solving was a native language. And Martha pulled boards from the other side and stacked them against the house with equal efficiency. And neither of them spoke much. But the silence had a quality to it that she could only describe, privately and with some surprise, as companionable. When the last board came down, the evening light poured through the glass and filled the room with something golden and warm, and Martha stood in the middle of it and looked around at the small, plain, tilting space that was hers, and she felt the particular pride of ownership, clean and sharp as a new pin. "I'll leave you to it," Martin said from the doorway. She turned. He was holding his hat, the way he had held it on the street in Caldwell, and he looked at her with that calm, honest expression that she had decided in the approximately 3 hours of his acquaintance was the most consistent thing about him. "Your barbed wire," she said. He blinked. "You were collecting barbed wire," she said. "For your property to the southeast, you haven't delivered it." "It'll keep until morning," he said. She considered that. "Where do you plan to sleep?" "I've got a bedroll," he said. "It's a fine night." She considered further. The cast-iron stove was functional. She had assessed this on her way out. "There is a perfectly serviceable floor in this house," she said, "and I have no interest in sleeping on it, which means the only person who would be diminished by sleeping outside on a fine night is you. I can make coffee on that stove if it draws properly, which it appears to." He looked at her for a moment that stretched in a way that was not uncomfortable but was, she became aware, significant. "That's a generous offer," he said. "It is a practical offer," she said with precision. "There is a difference. I'm not a generous woman by nature. I'm a practical one." Martin Wallace said nothing to that. He came inside, set his hat on the nail by the door that was exactly where a nail should be, and that was the first night of Martha Pritchard's life in Kansas. She made coffee on the stove, which drew well. Martin brought the remaining provisions from his wagon, a tin of salt crackers, a wedge of hard cheese, dried apple slices wrapped in paper, and laid them on the floor between them like a modest table, and they ate in the lamplight he'd brought in from the wagon, and they talked. They talked the way people sometimes talk when they are in a new place, and the ordinary rules of caution have been temporarily suspended by the strangeness of the circumstances and the honesty of the hour. He told her about his land, the cattle he'd built up from 12 head to over 60, the way the prairie grass was different from anything he'd known in Tennessee, the winter of 1873 that had taught him more about survival than the entire war had. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father who had bought land he would never see as an act of faith in a future he was already too sick to reach, about the way she had spent the last 2 years settling his estate and learning that everything she thought she knew about independence had been theoretical until the moment it became necessary. "You never thought about staying east?" he asked. "I thought about it constantly," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in quite some time. "And then I thought about what staying would mean, going to live with my cousin in Dayton, teaching school or taking in mending, watching the city fill up with the kind of living that belongs to other people and trying to be grateful for a corner of it." She looked at the lamp flame. "My father believed this land was something. I need to know if he was right." Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was right. She looked at him. "It's good land," he said. "The soil along the creek bottom will grow a kitchen garden without much argument. The higher ground is good grazing. This house can be made solid. It's not easy country, but it's honest country. What you put in is what you get back. No more and no less." "That sounds like a fair arrangement," she said. "It's the only fair arrangement I've ever encountered," he said, and there was something in his voice that told her this was a considered opinion, arrived at the long way. She was quiet. Outside, the night had settled into full dark, and the Kansas stars were doing their particular extravagance. There were so many of them, so emphatically present, that they seemed to press down on the plain like a second landscape, closer and more intimate than seemed reasonable. "I should let you sleep," he said, rising. "The floor is hard," she said, "and you have your bedroll. If you put it in the corner, I will be entirely at the other end of the room, and you will have rather more privacy than you would sleeping under a wagon." He looked at her. "You are a very practical woman, Martha Pritchard," he said. "I have been told this," she said. "It is not always meant as a compliment." "It is from me," he said. She went asleep that night on a pallet she made from her coat, and the one blanket she had carried in her carpet-bag. And she lay in the dark of her own house, in her own Kansas, and she listened to the wind move through the grass outside and the slow, steady breathing of a man she had known for half a day. And she felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she had arrived somewhere. Martin left before full dawn. She was already awake. She had slept lightly, the way you sleep in new places, and she heard him rise and collect his bedroll with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early mornings, and she kept her eyes closed because she was not entirely sure what her face was doing, and she was not ready to be looked at yet. She heard his boots on the puncheon floor, moving toward the door, and then they stopped. She waited. "There's a widow woman about 2 miles north on the road into town," he said quietly to the room. "Her name is Clara Holt. She knows this county well, and she is worth knowing. She'll trade milk and eggs for help with the heavier farm work if that's useful to you." Martha said nothing, kept her eyes closed, breathed evenly. "The Elm Creek water is clean," he continued in that same quiet, unhurried voice. "Follow it south for half a mile and it pools deep enough for washing. The cottonwood grove on the south bank has been used for years by the families out this way. The Comanche and Kiowa trade routes through here are long since changed by the reservation arrangements, so the county is quieter than it was in the early 70s. But you should know who the county sheriff is, man named Ed Pryor. Office is on the east side of Main Street in Caldwell. Been there since 1875. He is fair and he is competent." She listened to every word. "I will be back this way on Thursday," he said, "to deliver the wire properly. If you need anything before then, Henderson's store in town is your best resource. Tell them Martin Wallace sent you. It won't buy you anything extra, but it'll cut through the usual caution they give new arrivals." A pause. "Good morning, Martha," he said, and she heard the door open and close, and then the sound of the wagon and the horses growing smaller along the road to the south. And she lay in her house on the Kansas plain, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about what his voice sounded like when it said her name, which was not a practical thought, but which she had nonetheless with some conviction. The first month was hard in the way that first months always are, which is to say it was hard in ways she had anticipated, and also in ways she had not. She anticipated the physical demands, the work of making the house livable, clearing years of dust and mouse nests and general abandonment, mending the porch with lumber she bought at Henderson's, and carried herself in the wagon she rented from the livery stable, laying in provisions, hauling water until the well was cleared and tested and found good, planting the small fall kitchen garden along the creek bottom that would give her something green through November if the season held. She had not anticipated Clara Holt. Clara Holt was 53 years old, had been widowed in 1870 when her husband was thrown from a horse and died of the injury 3 days later, and had since that time run her 30-acre farm with a combination of iron-spined practicality and warm, comprehensive sociability that had made her something of an institution in the southeastern corner of Cowley County. She arrived at Martha's door 2 days after Martin's Thursday visit, which he had indeed made, delivering his barbed wire and spending 2 additional hours helping Martha assess the house's structural needs with the methodical attention of a man who was going to great lengths to make a practical reason for being somewhere. Clara arrived with a jar of honey, a wheel of cheese, a loaf of bread that was still warm, and information about every significant event that had occurred within a 5-mile radius of Elm Creek in the past 3 years, organized in no particular order but delivered with tremendous energy. "You're the Pritchard girl," she said, on the doorstep, and it was not a question. "Martin Wallace mentioned you were out here." "Did he?" said Martha. "He came by for eggs Tuesday morning," Clara said, coming inside without being precisely invited, which seemed to be her general approach. "Said there was a woman from Cincinnati settling the old Hendricks place, and she was sensible and capable, and I should come introduce myself. She set her basket on the counter Martha had made from a plank and 2 sawhorses." He said sensible first. I thought that was interesting. Martha looked at Clara Holt and decided, within approximately 90 seconds, that she liked her enormously, which was an unusual experience, as Martha generally liked people gradually and with reservations. "Sit down," Martha said. "I can make coffee." "I was hoping you'd say that," Clara said, and sat down, and they talked for 4 hours, and by the end of it Martha knew more about the county, the politics of the neighboring farms, the character of Ed Pryor the sheriff, the history of the creek flooding, the best time to plant in spring, and the specific personality of Martin Wallace as observed by a neighboring woman over approximately 9 years than she had learned from any other source. "He is a good man," Clara said over her third cup of coffee in the tone of someone summarizing a long argument. "Stubborn, private. He keeps his own counsel to a fault sometimes, but good." She looked at Martha over the rim of her cup. "He hasn't mentioned a woman out here since his wife died." Martha set down her coffee cup very carefully. "He was married." Clara's expression shifted into something gentler. 6 years ago, her name was Annalise. She was from a family that came out from Missouri, settled about 15 miles west. She and Martin were married 2 years. She died of fever in the summer of 1872. They were expecting their first child. A pause. Lost them both. The room was very quiet. Martha thought about Martin's face, the particular quality of his calm, the way he looked at the land with the expression of someone for whom the land was the one thing that had not failed to keep its promises. "I did not know," she said. "He doesn't tell people," Clara said. "It's not a secret exactly. It's just he doesn't find it easy to talk about things that hurt. He'd rather show you what he's decided by what he does." She set down her own cup. "He has never, in the 9 years I have known that man, offered to drive a stranger's wagon to her property and pull the boards off her windows." Martha said nothing. "I'm just noting the fact," Clara said, with the innocuous expression of a woman noting a great deal more than a fact. Thursday became Martin's day. This had not been formally arranged. It had simply evolved, the way certain things evolve in frontier country, through the practical logic of proximity and need, or what presented itself as practical logic to anyone who was not paying close attention to the frequency with which small excuses materialized to justify a 20-minute ride southeast from the Wallace property to the Pritchard Quarter section. He brought things. Not gifts in any romantic sense. He was too tactful for gifts, and she was too proud for charity, but things that presented themselves as practical. A box of extra nails, a length of good rope, a seed catalog from a firm in St. Louis that he mentioned in passing, already ordered from himself and didn't need. A map, hand-drawn and precise, of every water source within 3 miles of her property, with notes in his careful, slightly angular handwriting about which were seasonal and which were reliable year-round. The map she kept. She kept it in the box where she stored her father's papers, the deed and the surveyor's documents, and the letter her father had written to her in the last weeks of his life, in which he had described the Kansas land with such particular, hopeful precision that reading it felt like reading something sacred. She and Martin talked. They talked while he helped her with whatever he had found a reason to help with, and they talked while she showed him the progress she had made on her own, which she always made sure there was evident progress to show, because she was not going to be anyone's project, and he seemed to understand this without being told, which was one of the things she was beginning to find remarkable about him. They talked about the land and about weather and about the politics of Reconstruction, which had not resolved to anyone's satisfaction, and about the Indian question, which was what people called it then, the systematic displacement of the Comanche and Kiowa and other peoples from the southern plains, which Martin spoke of with a directness that she respected. He did not romanticize it, and he did not excuse it, and he named what it was, a removal achieved through force and treaty violation. And he said that the prosperity of every homesteader in Cowley County, including himself, including her, was built in part on that displacement, and that a person ought to be clear-eyed about the foundations of their own life. Martha had not expected this from him, and it changed something in her estimation of him, elevated it past the already high mark it had reached by the time of the map. October came in with a cold blue sky and wind that had character. The kitchen garden along the creek was finished, and the last of it put up in jars that Martha lined along the shelf Martin had built against the east wall of her kitchen. He had built it in the last week of September, on a Thursday, after she mentioned that she needed shelving, and he had not made much of it except to be very particular about the measurements, which she appreciated. She was in Caldwell one morning in mid-October when she encountered the difficulty that changed the shape of things. His name was Roy Kessler. He was one of 3 brothers who farmed loosely defined, a section of land about 4 miles north of town, and he was the kind of man who existed in every frontier community, thick-necked and small-eyed, and full of the particular contempt for women who owned property that came from never having been contradicted in an important way. He had apparently had some prior acquaintance with the Hendricks property, or had wanted to. Clara had told her something about a grazing dispute that had never been formally resolved before old Hendricks died, and he appeared at Martha's side in Henderson's store on an October morning with the attitude of a man who considered himself owed an accounting. "You're the one took the Hendricks land," he said, without introduction. Martha was examining a bolt of wool fabric for winter curtains. She looked up. "I purchased the Hendricks property, yes," she said. "That land's been run over by my cattle the past 2 years," Kessler said. "While it was sitting empty, I've got a claim." "Do you have a document," Martha said, "establishing that claim?" Kessler's face reddened in a way that answered the question. "I've got the right of use," he said. 2 years of use. Use without permission and without payment does not constitute a legal claim to the land," Martha said. "I suggest you speak to Sheriff Pryor if you believe otherwise, and he can explain the property law of Cowley County to you." This was, she understood as she said it, exactly the right legal position and exactly the wrong social strategy for a woman alone on a frontier property. Kessler was the kind of man who responded to a reasonable argument the way a wall responds to water, not by giving way, but by pushing back harder. She watched his face and she understood this clearly, and she felt, for the first time since arriving in Kansas, a specific, practical fear that was separate from all the other challenges she had faced, because those challenges had been the kind that yielded to effort and intelligence, and this one was of a different nature entirely. She went home. She was not going to do anything differently. She was not going to tell Martin, because this was her problem and her land, and she was going to handle it. She went home and she thought about it with the cold, clear concentration that she applied to every problem, and she wrote a letter to Sheriff Pryor outlining the situation, and she mended the east fence line that Kessler's cattle had clearly been pushing through, and she went on. Martin came on Thursday. He had flour and a piece of news. The Atchison line was extending a spur that would come within 2 miles of the Elm Creek settlements by next year, which would transform the economics of every farm in the area. And he saw the new fence posts along the east line immediately, because Martin Wallace noticed land the way other men notice faces, with involuntary attention and total recall. "New posts on the east line," he said. Martha was making biscuits. She did not turn around. "The fence needed mending." A pause. "Kessler's been pushing cattle through that line." She turned then. He was leaning in the doorway in his characteristic way, arms folded, watching her with that sage-green gaze that she had learned in 6 weeks to read with some precision, and what she read in it now was that he already knew. "Clara told you," she said. "Clara is the most well-informed woman in Cowley County," he said. "What happened in Henderson's?" "I handled it," she said. "I expect you did," he said, without any implication that this was surprising. "But Kessler doesn't let things go easily. His brother Holt different from our Clara Holt, no relation. He had a similar dispute with the Prentice family last year, and it turned unpleasant before Ed Pryor got involved." "I've written to Pryor," she said. Martin nodded. pushed off from the doorway and came into the room. "Good. That's the right move. And I'll stop by Pryor's office when I'm in town next and mention the situation from my end." Kessler listens to men in ways he won't listen to women, which is a failure of his character and not yours. "I know that," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm not explaining it to you. I'm telling you what I'm going to do about the part of it that I can be useful for." She looked at him. There was flour on her hands. He was standing 6 feet away in her kitchen, which had become, she was aware of this, she was tracking it the way you track something you're not quite ready to look at directly. His presence in her house had become, over the past 6 weeks, as natural and expected as the morning light through the east window. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the biscuits she was making with considerable focus, and he said, "Do you want help with those?" She laughed. It surprised her, it surprised them both. It was a real laugh, not the polite social approximation she usually deployed, but the actual thing, sudden and warm, and she felt it move through her like water through ground that had been dry for a very long time. "You want to help me make biscuits," she said. "I make excellent biscuits," he said, with a dignity that was slightly undermined by the fact that it was clearly true. "Then wash your hands," she said, and moved over to make room at the counter. They made biscuits. It was an absurdly ordinary thing, and it was entirely extraordinary. He was neat and methodical about it, and his biscuits, when they came out of the oven on the Dutch oven shelf, were in fact very good, and they ate them at the small table she had set up in the kitchen with the salt pork and the last of the September garden pickles. And it was nothing, just 2 people eating dinner, and it was everything. The conversation that evening ranged from practical to personal and back in the easy, unguarded way that had become characteristic of Thursday evenings. And at some point, she couldn't have said when exactly the shift occurred, they were talking about music. About what music they had known before this prairie life that was too wide for most things to echo properly. "My mother played piano," Martin said. "Sunday evenings, after supper, she played hymns mostly, but sometimes she'd play other things, parlor songs, things she'd known before she married." He looked at the table. "I haven't thought about that in a long time." "Do you miss Tennessee?" she asked. He thought about it with the seriousness he applied to all genuine questions. "I miss the specific things," he said. "The mountains, the way the trees looked in October, the smell of the river in summer." A pause. "I don't miss who I was there. I was a different man in Tennessee, and I don't think he was better." "What was he like?" she asked. "Angrier," Martin said simply, "and less honest. I had the war and the loss of my wife and 6 years of this prairie to sand down the parts of me that weren't worth keeping, and I believe, I am a better version of myself than I would have been if none of those things had happened, which is a strange thing to be grateful for." Martha was quiet. Outside, the first cold stars were out and the wind had died to a whisper. The lamp flame stood straight and still. "My father used to say," she said, "that difficulty is just the price of the person you're becoming." She paused. "I thought it was a platitude when he said it. Now I think he was very precise." Martin looked at her across the table, and the look held for a moment longer than it needed to. And in that moment Martha Pritchard felt something that she had been feeling for several weeks now and had been treating with the same careful, deliberate approach she took to all important things, noting it, examining it, setting it aside to be considered more fully at a later time. She had been considering it for several weeks. She was beginning to run out of later time. Kessler appeared at her property 3 days after that, on a Sunday morning when the sky was high and cold, and the grass had gone brown and winter-colored. He came with one of his brothers, a shorter, quieter version of himself named Dale, and they rode up to the house and sat their horses in front of her door with the particular body language of men who expected the language of their bodies to be sufficient argument. Martha came outside. "Miss Pritchard," Kessler said, "I want to settle this matter of the east grazing." "The matter is settled," she said. "I have corresponding with Sheriff Pryor, who has confirmed the position I stated in Henderson's store." "You have no legal claim to this land." "Legal," Kessler repeated, in a tone that made it clear he found the concept somewhat beside the point. I've got cattle that winter on that ground every year. I've got no other arrangement made. That is a planning failure on your part, she said, and not a charge against this property. Kessler leaned forward on his saddle horn. You're a long way from town, he said. It was not a threat in any way a lawyer could argue. It was a statement of geographic fact. But the way he said it, with the deliberate, unhurried weight of a man reminding a woman of her vulnerability, made the skin on the back of Martha's neck tighten. She heard a horse on the road from the south. Martin had been checking the south fence line on his own property and had come up along Elm Creek the long way back to his place, which took him past Martha's eastern boundary, which he had been doing with some regularity since Clara had told him about Kessler, which was information that had not made him angry in any dramatic way, but had settled into the back of his mind with the quiet, focused weight of something that needed watching. He came around the bend in the road, and he saw the two Kessler horses at Martha's door and Martha on her porch, and the particular angle of her shoulders, which he had learned to read with the same careful attention he gave to weather, and he rode up to the fence without haste, which was more effective than urgency would have been, and he said, "Morning, Roy," in a voice that was entirely friendly and not 1 degree warmer than necessary. Roy Kessler straightened in his saddle and looked at Martin Wallace with the calculation of a man assessing an argument that has just become more complicated. "Wallace," he said. "Fine morning," Martin said. He didn't look at Martha, not directly, which she understood was deliberate. Making this about Kessler and not about her would serve better than anything that looked like intervention. "You boys settling something out here?" "Having a conversation," Kessler said. "Good," Martin said pleasantly. "Long as it stays a conversation. I'd hate for Sheriff Pryor to have to make a ride out this way. He's a busy man." He said it the way you say something that has no edge but has considerable weight, and he looked at Kessler with that level, winter-sage gaze, and Kessler looked back. And Dale Kessler was looking at his saddle horn, which told you everything about how Dale Kessler felt about this particular moment. After a silence that was not comfortable for anyone except possibly Martin, who was as comfortable in silence as most people are in familiar rooms, Roy Kessler wheeled his horse. "We'll see each other around, Miss Pritchard," he said, which was also not a threat a lawyer could argue and was also clearly one. "No doubt," she said. They rode north. Martin walked his horse to the fence and dismounted and came to the gate, and Martha lifted the latch without comment and let him through. "You were handling it," he said. "I was," she agreed. "The timing was coincidental," he said. She looked at him. "Was it?" He met her eyes, a pause. "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She was aware of a feeling she did not have a single tidy word for: gratitude and irritation and something else entirely, something warmer and less manageable than either. "I do not want to be protected," she said. "I want to be capable." "You are capable," he said, without any condescension in it at all. "And I was in the neighborhood." She looked at him. He was standing 3 feet from her in the gray November light, his hat in his hands, his expression steady and honest and careful. And she thought about Annalise, who had died in the summer of 1872 with their child, and about the man who had been sanded down by grief and work, and the enormous honest prairie into the version standing in front of her. And she thought about how much of her own life had been the long process of becoming capable of being exactly here, in this moment, on this piece of ground. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee." He came inside. He always came inside. It was November, the second week, when he kissed her, and it happened the way things happen when they've been a long time building, suddenly and without surprise, which is the only way anything important happens. She had been reading aloud from a book. She was working through the copy of Middlemarch she'd brought in her carpet bag, one of the 2 books she'd allowed herself, the other being a practical guide to prairie agriculture. And he had been mending a bridle that needed attention, and the lamplight was warm, and the stove was making the small, domestic sounds it made when it was well fired, and she had read a particular passage about the nature of unhistoric acts and the growing good of the world. and she'd looked up to say something about it, and he was already looking at her. "What?" she said. He set down the bridle. He stood up from the floor where he'd been sitting. He crossed the room, which took perhaps 4 steps, and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who has decided something and is done deliberating. "Martha," he said. That was all he said, just her name. And then he cupped her face in both his hands, which were rough and warm and very careful, and he kissed her. She had been kissed before. She was 26 years old, and she had not lived entirely without experience. But she had not been kissed like this, not with this particular quality of attention, as though nothing in the world existed except the specific, essential fact of her, as though the kiss were a statement of something he had been thinking for a long time and had finally found the right words for. She kissed him back. She had her hand on his chest, against the rough canvas of his coat, and she felt his heart, and it was fast, which she found enormously reassuring, because this was not a man for whom things were easy, and the fact that it was not easy meant it was real. When they broke apart, she was still holding his coat. He was still holding her face. "I have been thinking about that," he said, "for approximately 6 weeks. 7, she said. He looked at her. 7 weeks, she said. Since the wagon. When you said it was honest country, she felt the color in her face and did not attempt to prevent it. I have been thinking about this since then." His hands moved from her face to her shoulders, resting there, and he looked at her with an expression so unguarded that it hurt to look at, in the specific way that seeing someone without their armor always hurts a little. "I'm not an easy man," he said. "I have to tell you that. I'm private and I am stubborn, and there are things in me that are still working through." He paused. "But I am honest, and I am not going to be anything other than completely honest with you, whatever else I am. I am not an easy woman," she said. "I am proud and I am particular, and I do not admit weakness graciously. I'm better at doing things than at allowing them to be done for me, and I am working on this." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was almost a smile, but deeper than a smile. "We're a pair," he said. "Apparently," she said. He kissed her again, and this one was different from the first, less urgent, more deliberate, like something he was savoring rather than claiming, and she leaned into it with the particular, considered wholeness of a woman who has thought about something very carefully and has made her decision. They were married in February of 1879, which gave the county approximately 3 months to form opinions, which it did with enthusiasm. Clara Holt was the primary architect of the wedding, which she organized with the same comprehensive energy she applied to all things, and which took place at the small Methodist church in Caldwell on a Saturday that was cold and bright and smelled of snow coming from the northwest. Martha wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and her hair was done by Clara's 16-year-old niece, who was visiting from Emporia and had opinions about such things. And she stood at the front of that small church and watched Martin Wallace walk toward her with the expression of a man who is looking at the specific thing he wants more than any other thing in his life. And she held very still and let herself be looked at, which was something she was still learning to do. The ceremony was short, because it was cold and the church's heating was approximate. They said the words, and the minister said the words, and Clara cried, which surprised no one, and Roy Kessler's land dispute had been resolved by Sheriff Pryor in October with the formal legal clarity that Martha had been confident it would reach. So Roy Kessler was not in the church, which was everyone's preference. They drove back to the Pritchard property afterward. It would be some time before questions of whose property it was settled into the natural grammar of their shared life, in the wagon, with the wedding guests diminishing behind them in the cold afternoon, and the prairie spread around them in its winter colors, brown and gold and faded silver, and the creek ice-edged at the banks and bright in the middle where the water still ran clear. "Well," Martha said. "Well," Martin agreed. She looked at him. He was watching the horses and the road, and the winter light was on his profile, and she thought, not for the first time, that she would never be tired of looking at him. I should mention, she said conversationally, that I have placed the seed orders for spring. I've been corresponding with a supplier in Kansas City who has an excellent variety of winter wheat that should do well in our soil along the creek. Martin kept his eyes on the road. Our soil, he said. You have the better grazing ground, she said. I have the better bottomland. Combined, we have a complete operation. I've been thinking about this since October. A pause. Since before October. He turned to look at her then, full on, and the look on his face was one she wanted to be able to describe but couldn't, because the English language, which she had always considered adequate to most purposes, turned out not to have the right word for the expression of a man who is looking at a woman who has been planning your shared future since before she was willing to admit she wanted one. Since before October, he said. I was being practical, she said, with the composure of a woman who has had years of practice in the art of retrospective dignity. You were being hopeful, he said. She looked at the road. That too, she said. He put his arm around her in the wagon in the February cold, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the horses moved steadily southeast along Elm Creek, and that was that. The spring of 1879 was good. It came in early and warm, with enough rain to make the creek bottom soft and workable, and Martha's winter wheat went in through March with the help of a hired hand she took on. A young man named James Teller from the Osage Mission settlement, 18 years old, the son of a freed family who had homesteaded in the eastern part of the county and who was, she was given to understand quickly, worth 3 times what she was paying him, and she adjusted the wages accordingly. Martin had expanded his cattle operation by 12 head the previous fall and was running 62 cattle across his acreage, with the plan to add more in summer. They had agreed it had taken 2 conversations and one particular Thursday evening that ran late into the argument of who had the better commercial instinct, which ended inconclusively and pleasantly, to run the 2 properties as a single operation while keeping the deeds separate. Martha's name stayed on her deed. Martin's name stayed on his. What they were building together occupied both pieces of ground and answered to both names. It was Martin who first said he loved her, because Martha could no more have said it first than she could have walked into Caldwell and announced that she'd been lost on her first day. Not because she didn't feel it, she had felt it, she estimated, since somewhere around the time he had built her a shelf in his careful, methodical way and said nothing about it being a kindness, but because the word required a kind of exposure she was still, in the early spring of 1879, building up to. He said it on an April evening when they were on the porch. She had repaired the porch, level and solid now, facing east toward the creek, watching the light go out of the sky and the fireflies beginning their first tentative appearances along the creek bottom. He said it simply, without preamble or strategy, the way he said everything important. I love you, Martha. She was quiet for a moment. The fireflies floated and blinked in the blue dusk. I know, she said, and she meant it not dismissively but as what it was, an acknowledgment of something she had known for some time, had been holding carefully while she worked up to the response it deserved. He looked at her. I love you, she said. I have for, I think probably since before October, since I am apparently a woman who commits to things well in advance of admitting it. He took her hand, there on the porch, and held it, and they watched the fireflies until it was full dark, and the stars came out above them in their extraordinary Kansas density, and the creek ran in the dark below the cottonwoods, and the house behind them was warm and lit with lamplight. And it was, Martha thought, the most contented she had ever been in her life. She told him she was expecting a child on a Thursday morning in July of 1879, just before the harvest came in. She had been certain for 3 weeks, and had needed the 3 weeks to decide how to say it, which was more about her nature than about any specific difficulty. She told him over breakfast, because she was a practical woman and mornings were for facts, and she said, I believe we are going to have a child in February, and Martin Wallace, who was a private man and a composed man and a man who had lost a wife and a child 6 years before, and had built his composure over that loss with the careful, painful craft of someone who intends to survive, put down his coffee cup, and covered his face with both hands for a long, long moment. And she went around the table and put her arms around his shoulders from behind, and he reached up and took her hands, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed saying. He was very quiet for the rest of the day. He worked hard, the way he worked when something was moving through him, and she let him, because she understood that he was doing what needed doing to get himself from one side of this feeling to the other. That evening he came back to the house, and he looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so full of something complex and luminous that she had to look away first, which she had never done before. "I am going to be very careful with you," he said. "I am not fragile," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you are precious. There is a difference." She let that be said. She even, in the privacy of her own chest, let it matter. The winter wheat harvest was good. They worked it together, she and Martin and James Teller and 2 extra hands from the county, and the yield was respectable for a first-year planting, and Henderson's store bought the surplus at a fair price, and Martha entered the numbers in her ledger with the satisfied precision of a woman whose father's faith was being justified in concrete and measurable terms. She wrote a letter to her cousin in Dayton that fall. She had been corresponding with this cousin, a woman named Frances, 5 years older than Martha, practical and kind in her own way, since arriving in Kansas, keeping her informed of developments with the measured regularity of someone who is not accustomed to confiding, but who maintains the form of it out of affection. The letter she wrote in October was different. She described the property and the harvest and the house and Martin and James Teller's exceptional competence and Clara Holt's comprehensive sociability, and she wrote at the end of it, in a sentence that cost her something and was worth it, "I think my father was right, Frances, about all of it." February came. The child was born on a Tuesday, which seemed fitting to Martha, because her life was organized around Thursdays and she appreciated the counterpoint. The birth was attended by the county midwife, a woman named Rosa Garcia who had been born in Chihuahua, Mexico, had come north with her husband in the 1860s, and had delivered approximately 200 children in Cowley County and the surrounding territories with a combination of skill and gentle authority that made everyone feel that everything was entirely under control, which it was. Martin waited outside with the particular, coiled stillness of a man who has taught himself not to expect the worst, but who can feel the old fear moving through him like weather through a crack in a wall. He sat on the porch in the February cold, and Clara Holt sat beside him because she had come as soon as she heard, which was her nature, and she didn't say anything, which was her wisdom. The baby cried. It was a specific, emphatic cry, the cry of a child who has opinions about its new circumstances and is wasting no time expressing them. Martin stood up from the porch. Rosa Garcia appeared at the door. "A boy," she said. "Healthy. Your wife is well." The expression on Martin Wallace's face at that moment was something Clara Holt described for years afterward, when she told the story, which she told often, to anyone who would hear it, with the embellishments of a woman who understood that some stories deserve their fullest treatment. He went inside. Martha was tired and fierce, propped against the pillows she had arranged in the practical, self-sufficient way of someone who had organized her own confinement, holding the baby in her arms with the concentrated attention of someone encountering the most important thing they have ever seen. "He has your jaw," she said. Martin sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby. The baby was very new and very red and had his eyes firmly shut, as though light was something he intended to negotiate the terms of before committing to it. "He's beautiful," Martin said, which he had not expected to say and said anyway, because the word presented itself as the only accurate one. "He is," Martha agreed, with the calm certainty of a woman stating a verified fact. "What do we call him?" Martin asked. She had thought about this. She had thought about it for months in the way she thought about things comprehensively from multiple angles, arriving at a conclusion and sitting with it long enough to be certain. "Thomas," she said, "after my father." Martin nodded. He put one finger against the baby's fist, which was curled tight, and the baby grabbed it with the reflexive, total trust of the newborn, and Martin's face did something she could not describe and would not try to. "Thomas Wallace," he said. She looked at him. "Thomas Wallace," she agreed, "though I expect he'll make his own name eventually." "Let's give him a few years," Martin said. She laughed, and the baby stirred at the sound of her voice, and she held him closer, and Martin sat beside her on the bed and put his arm around her and looked at what they had made together. Not just the child, but the life, the whole construction of it. The land and the house and the level porch and the seed orders and the Thursday evenings and the long conversation that had started on a Caldwell Street in September of 1878, with a woman too proud to ask for directions and a man with enough patience to offer them slowly. Clara Holt found them like that when she came in 10 minutes later. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and she was too full of feeling to produce words, which was unprecedented in her history, and she simply pressed her hand to her mouth and looked, and then she collected herself and said that there was coffee on and that someone was going to eat something even if she had to stand over them until they did. James Teller, when he came by the next day, was so moved by the introduction to Thomas Wallace that he stayed 3 hours, past what he'd intended, and held the baby with the terrified, gentle care of someone who has never held anything this important, and in the following weeks proved to be the kind of young man who is, it turns out, deeply interested in children and excellent at amusing them, which added another dimension to his already considerable value as a member of their operation. Spring of 1880 came in with good rain and warm light, and the fields along Elm Creek were deep green with the second year's winter wheat, and Martin's cattle herd was up to 74 head, and Thomas Wallace, who was 2 months past his first birthday, had developed a robust interest in the world that expressed itself primarily through motion and volume. He had taken his first steps in the kitchen doorway on an April morning while Martha was at the stove and Martin was washing his hands at the basin, and both of them had stood completely still for a moment, watching him, and then Martha had said, "Well," and Martin had said, "Yes," and Thomas had sat down abruptly on the kitchen floor and looked at his hands with the expression of someone who has just accomplished something significant and is trying to determine what it means. The spur line from the Atchison came through in the spring of 1880, as Martin had predicted it would, and it transformed the economics of the area precisely as he had said it would, and the price Martha got for her surplus wheat improved by a margin she found deeply satisfying, and she allowed herself one quiet, private moment of vindication about the seed orders she had placed in the fall of 1878. Roy Kessler, whose name had not appeared in the story of their lives since Sheriff Pryor resolved the property dispute in October of 1879, sold his section north of town to a family from Illinois in the summer of 1880 and left the county for somewhere in Colorado Territory, which was, in the general opinion of the southeastern corner of Cowley County, an improvement in the local quality of life. Clara Holt came to dinner every Sunday. This had been formalized by consensus in the spring of 1879, and no one had seen any reason to modify the arrangement, and Clara had in that time become the kind of presence in their household that is not quite family and not quite something else but is rather itself, its own category, the person who is simply always there in the ways that matter and is called accordingly. Thomas adored her. By the time he was 18 months old, he had developed a whole vocabulary of specific sounds dedicated to Clara's appearance, and she treated his attentions with the gravity they deserved. Frances, Martha's cousin from Dayton, came for a visit in September of 1880. She came on the Atchison line and arrived in Caldwell and was collected by Martin in the wagon, and she sat on the wagon bench on the road southeast along Elm Creek and said nothing for a long time, looking at the Kansas landscape, and then she said, "It's so open. in a tone that suggested she had not fully believed in the openness until this moment. "Yes," Martin said. "Martha said the sky was different here," Francis said. "I didn't know what she meant." "You have to see it to understand it," he said. Francis stayed 2 weeks. She played with Thomas for long, happy hours in the kitchen while Martha and Martin worked the fall harvest, and she helped Clara put up the last of the garden, and on her last evening she sat with Martha on the porch in the early autumn cool and said, "I understand now." "Understand what?" Martha asked, though she knew. "All of it," Francis said. She looked at the darkening field and the creek glinting in the last light, and the house with the lamp in the window and Martin coming across the yard from the barn with Thomas on his shoulders, Thomas's small hands gripping Martin's hat brim for balance, both of them laughing at something only they could hear. "Your father bought land he never saw," she said, "and somehow he was right about it." Martha watched her husband and her son cross the yard in the long September evening light. "He trusted that the land would give back what you put in," she said. "He was right." Thomas was asleep in his crib before Frances had finished the night's letter to her husband in Dayton, and Martha and Martin sat for a while on the porch after Frances went to bed, not talking much, the way they often didn't talk much in the evenings, which was comfortable in the specific way that sharing silence with someone is comfortable when you have built enough between you that the silence is full rather than empty. "She's good," Martin said. "Your cousin." "She is," Martha agreed. "She has always been good. I was not always easy for her to be good to." Martin looked at her. "I was not always easy," Martha said. "I know this about myself." "You were particular," he said. "I was proud," she said, with the precision of someone making an accurate historical record. "When I arrived in Caldwell, I would rather have walked to the wrong property and back again twice than admit I didn't know where I was going." "I know," he said. "You knew then," she said. "I suspected then," he said. "I knew when you said Elm Creek and then corrected yourself halfway through the word because you were going to ask and then decided you weren't." She turned to look at him. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything about you from the moment I saw you standing in front of the land office holding your carpet bag like you were going to defend your honor with it," he said. He was smiling, actually smiling, the real version that she had been cataloging since the early days because it was not common, and for that reason was valuable. "You were the most deliberately composed, lost person I had ever seen." "I was not lost," she said with dignity. "You were extremely lost," he said. "I had general directional awareness," she said. "Martha," he said. "I was lost," she said. "I was absolutely, completely lost." And she was laughing again, the real kind, and he was laughing with her, and the sound of it went out into the Kansas night, and the stars were everywhere, and the creek was running in the dark, and the fields were ready for fall, and Thomas was asleep inside, and the life that had begun with a woman too proud to ask for directions was everything it had promised to be and more than she had known to hope for. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was cold and long, but it was the kind of winter that farms are built to sustain. They had laid in enough wood and provisions, and the cattle fared well in the shelter Martin had constructed along the south side of the grazing range. And Thomas Wallace, now almost 2 years old, discovered the enormous pleasure of being taken out into the snow by his father, who had extremely specific opinions about the correct way to build a snow structure, and communicated them to Thomas with an earnestness that made Martha, watching from the kitchen window with her coffee, feel something move through her so warm and so complete that she had to stand still with it for a moment and breathe. She was expecting their second child. She had known since November. She told Martin in December, because she had learned in the year and a half of their marriage that the particular pride that kept her from admitting she was lost on a Kansas street in 1878 was a tool with uses and limitations, and that the person you loved was not an adversary in front of whom you had to be invulnerable. She told him over breakfast on a December morning, and his response was different from the first time, still careful, still full of the old layered feeling, but lighter, because he was lighter now than he had been then. He kissed her first and then asked when, and she said June, and he said good, because June was easier weather for it, which was such an entirely practical and accurate observation that she loved him for it specifically and immediately. The baby was born in June of 1881, in the warm light of a long summer day, delivered again by Rosa Garcia, who arrived with her bag and her competent authority and had the whole matter resolved by mid-afternoon. A girl this time, with Martin's light eyes and what Rosa Garcia said with confident authority was definitely Martha's chin, which Martha found both accurate and pleasing. Martin came in from outside, where he had sat with Clara again, Clara Holt, who arrived for births and crises and ordinary Sundays with the same reliable frequency, and saw the baby in Martha's arms and knelt beside the bed and looked at his daughter with an expression of absolute uncomplicated wonder. "What do we call her?" he asked. Martha had thought about this carefully, as she thought about everything. "Anna," she said. She met his eyes. If you would like." His expression shifted into something that was very quiet and very full, and she could see him with it, working through it, and she waited. "For Analyze," he said. "If you'd like," she said. "Or simply Anna for itself, it's a good name." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Anna, yes." He touched the baby's face with one careful finger. "Anna Wallace." Another pause. "Thank you, Martha." "She should have a name that means something," Martha said simply. "Everything should mean something." Martin looked at her, and in his face was the sum of everything. The creek and the field and the Thursday evenings and the winter wheat and the level porch and the full years they had built, and the specific shape of the life they had made from two separate pieces of stubborn, honest, capable human being, fitted together with the patience of good craftsmanship. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. And then she said it back, without the pause, without the careful approach, just cleanly and directly, because she had learned. She was still learning. She would be learning this her whole life, that love is not a concession. It is a fact. And facts on the honest Kansas plain are the only currency worth holding. Thomas Wallace was introduced to his sister on a June afternoon that was bright and warm and full of meadowlark song, and he regarded her with the intense, puzzled attention of a boy who has been told something significant is happening and is not yet sure what his opinion of it is. He touched her hand with one finger, the way Martin had, and Anna Wallace grabbed it the same way Thomas had grabbed Martin's finger 16 months before, with that same reflexive, total trust, and Thomas looked at his father with an expression that was halfway between alarm and amazement. "She does that," Martin said. Thomas looked at the baby and then at his father and then at the baby again. "She's very small," he said. "She is," Martin agreed. Thomas considered this for a long time. "She can have some of my biscuits," he said finally, with the grave generosity of a child granting significant largesse. Martha from the bed said, "She'll be ready for biscuits in about a year, Thomas." Thomas nodded, accepting this timeline. "I'll save some," he said. It was Clara who told the story at every wedding and every gathering for the next 30 years. The story of the woman who came off the Atchison Santa Fe in September of 1878, with a carpetbag and a deed and a chin that dared the world to find fault with her direction, and the man who leaned against the land office post and watched her be so specifically, deliberately lost that it was almost magnificent. She told it with warmth and accuracy, and the embellishments of someone who loves a story and knows that some stories are large enough to carry decoration, and she always ended it the same way. "He offered directions," Clara would say at the end of it, leaning forward with her coffee in her hand, and she took them slowly, very slowly. And then she would laugh, and whoever was listening would laugh, and across whatever room or field or porch they were gathered on, Martha Pritchard Wallace would be doing whatever she was doing, working, or reading, or managing something with the focused efficiency that never left her, and she would look up and catch her husband's eye, and something would pass between them that needed no translation. James Teller stayed. He had intended to work one season and see. The season became 2, became 5, became the decade and past it. And by the time the Wallace operation had grown to include 200 acres under cultivation and close to 100 cattle, James Teller was the foreman of it, a fact that was settled and understood by everyone involved as the natural outcome of ability and time. He was, by 1885, also courting the daughter of a farming family named Chen, who had settled 12 miles east of Caldwell. A remarkable family who had come west against every pressure the country put on people who looked as they did, and who had planted their roots in Cowley County with the same stubborn intent that Martha recognized from her own first September. And she thought about that recognition often, about what it required of people to plant themselves in difficult ground. And she held it close. The Wallace children grew. Thomas was steady and particular like his father, with his mother's dark eyes and his mother's direct tongue, which emerged earlier than anyone was fully prepared for and proved to be accurate at all times, which was both the challenge and the virtue of it. He developed a passion for the land itself, not just the farming of it but the nature of it, the grasses and the birds, and the way the creek moved in different seasons. That made his mother put aside the agricultural catalog one spring evening in 1886 when he was 7 years old, and order him a natural history book from a firm in Chicago, because she recognized in his questions the shape of a serious mind, and she understood that serious minds need to be taken seriously. Anna grew into her father's eyes and her mother's chin, and had, somehow, the particular combination of their natures that created something entirely her own, a fearless sociability that was not her mother's careful reserve or her father's quiet watchfulness, but a third thing, warm and direct and thoroughly Anna, that made her the center of whatever room she was in by simple force of interest in everything and everyone present. Clara Holt took full credit for this quality and was not entirely wrong to do so. Martin expanded the cattle operation incrementally, in the way he did everything methodically, sustainedly, without drama. By 1888, the Wallace operation was one of the most reliably profitable in the county, not the largest, but the most consistent, and consistency was what the land rewarded in the long run, as Martin had known since 1869 and had told Martha in September of 1878. And she had used that information in every season since. They had one more child, a son born in 1884 in November, a great surprise to everyone including Martha, who had considered their family complete. They named him William, called him Will from the first, and he turned out to be a child of such even, cheerful temperament that he was a daily reminder that character is its own thing, distinct from circumstance and instruction, and arrives in a person's life according to its own schedule. The house was added to. Not in the first years. In the first years it was the original 2 rooms and the cast-iron stove and the level porch, and that was sufficient and more. But over time, as the family grew and the resources allowed, they added a room to the east and then a proper kitchen to the back, and in 1887 Martin built a second porch along the south side, because Martha had mentioned once, in the fall of 1885, that she thought the south-facing side of the house caught the winter light better, and he had spent 2 years arranging the time and materials to do something about it. The second porch faced the fields. It faced the wheat in its seasons and the cattle on the rise to the south, and Elm Creek's cottonwood line, and beyond that, the enormous continuing sky. Martha sat on it on a morning in October of 1889. The children gone about their lives, Thomas 10 and serious, Anna 8 and everywhere, Will 5 and delightful with her coffee and her ledger, and the particular satisfaction of a woman who is looking at something she built. Martin came around the corner of the house from the barn, moving with the familiar ease of a man on his own ground, and he saw her on the new porch, and he stopped for a moment the way he sometimes stopped when he wasn't expecting her, as though he still needed a second to account for the fact of her. She watched him stop, and she felt what she always felt, that deep, settled warmth, Not exciting in the way of beginnings, but sustaining in the way of things that are real and true and have been tested by every season. She felt grateful, specifically, for the way the world had put her down in the wrong place at the right time, and for the stubborn pride that had kept her standing on a Caldwell street studying a horizon she couldn't read, and for the man who had read it for her gently, without making her feel the cost of needing it. "Coffee's fresh," she said. He came up onto the porch and sat beside her and took the cup she held out, and they looked at the fields together, and the October light was long and golden across the grass, and the creek shone in the distance, and everything they had made was visible from where they sat. "What are you calculating?" he asked, nodding at the ledger. "Spring planting projections," she said. "I think we should add 15 acres of sorghum along the South Creek bottom. The market price is holding, and I think it holds." "I think you're right," he said. "I am," she said. He looked at her. The almost smile, which had become over 11 years a full and genuine smile and was even better than she had initially calculated, came up in his face, warm and complete. "You are," he agreed. She turned to look at him. He was gray at the temples now, which had happened gradually and suited him, and he looked at her with the same sage-green eyes and the same honest, open attention that had arrested her on a Caldwell street in September of 1878. And she thought, as she sometimes thought when she caught him looking at her this way, that it was remarkable how a single September afternoon could be the hinge on which an entire life turned. She had been lost. She had been too proud to say so. He had offered directions, and she had taken them slowly, carefully, on her own terms, at her own pace, and arrived. It had taken a year and change from that September street to that February church, at a life that was more than she had known to want. She put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail. He turned his hand and held hers. The morning light moved across the Kansas fields. The creek ran below the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the yard, Will was talking to the chickens with the earnest sociability he applied to all living things, and his voice carried in the clear October air, and the chickens were replying in the way chickens do, which seemed to satisfy him. Thomas would come home from school that afternoon with a question about bird migration that needed answering, and Anna would have a disagreement with a school friend that would need resolving with the particular diplomacy that Anna's direct nature required as supplement. And there would be dinner to make and accounts to finalize, and a fence post on the north line that Martin had mentioned needed looking at before winter. And all of it would be done. All of it would be managed, because they were capable, both of them. And because they had built this life together from the ground up, with honesty and patience and stubbornness, and flower-covered hands on a Thursday evening in October of 1878. Martha Pritchard Wallace looked at her husband and her fields and her creek and her Kansas sky. 15 acres of sorghum, she said. 15 acres, he agreed. And the morning held them, as mornings do when you have made a life worth holding, and the day began the way all their days began together, on solid ground in the honest Kansas light.